My name's Tim and I'm an alcoholic. You've given me a wonderful welcome. The Sydney people gave me a wonderful welcome. Thank you to all the people who organised this and have made this possible today. The people who are doing so in full sight and the people who are doing so behind the scenes. I'm grateful to have somewhere to come. I missed my home group to come here. So I'm glad there is a... Do you have a sufficient substitute? Well, you do have a sufficient substitute. My home group is, well, it's a kind of double group. There's a Hoxton Big Book Step meeting on a Friday, Brick Lane Big Book Study on a Saturday. The Friday one, which has just finished, it's evening back home. It's about an hour long. We read a short passage from the big book on a particular step. A speaker then shares for 10 minutes on that passage. And then 15 people share for 3 minutes each on that passage. And it's not because we've really told them to, it's just that's what we want to do. So there's no coercion. We create a strong structure. And within that, people can do what they want. But ultimately, what I've learned in the program is I've got the freedom to do God's will, but that's the only thing I want to do when I'm in my right mind. So it looks like it's disciplined and organized, and it's not. We do that because our lives depend on it. And where all the members of my home group are now is at dinner afterwards. We go for dinner after my home group on a Friday. There are usually 30, 35 people there. On Saturday, we go for dinner, 45 to 50 people at dinner. Because we want people to have somewhere to go on a Friday and a Saturday evening. I don't know about your drinking, but mine was a tornado which ran through my social life, amongst other things. I did not have crowds of people to hang out with on a Friday or Saturday evening. And we don't want anyone to leave our home group and have to go off into the dark night on their own, wondering how they're going to get through the next 24 hours. And I know that once fellowship is over and that the meal is finished, people are going to go off in twos and threes and carry on talking until there's nothing left to say. With my sponsor, I keep the conversations brief. He has 90-second crisis calls. The first 15 seconds of those are where I present the problem, and the next 75 seconds are where he presents the solution, then there's a little click. Now, he tells me he loves me before the click. I'm English, so I still can't quite deal with that, but I'm convinced he has my best interests at heart, even if what he says rubs me up the wrong way. I said to him once, "Do you support me?" He said, "I support you. I don't support your character defects." Then there's a little pause, and he said, "And you shouldn't either. Your ego is not your amigo." He lives in Texas near the Mexican border. We get a lot of that linguistic stuff coming through from the other side of the river. It amazes me that I'm sober here today. The neighbor's cat. Now, the neighbors would say that the cat belongs to them. I think the cat would say the neighbors serve her. But she's taken an interest in us for the last couple of years. Her name is, my other half revealed that her name is Magic Kitten. It's not what the neighbors call her. They have a different name. But anyway, she scratches at the door and scratches at the door, desperate to be let in. And is always upset with us that we've taken so long to get to the door, to open the door, and she marches straight past us, looks up in contempt, and then goes to do her, rubbing her face against the corners and looking for the food and doing all of the other things she needs to do. And for her, it's sometimes she's crying at the door in the morning. We discover, from 4 in the morning she's out there, but we don't wake up till 6, and she comes in. And she's cold, and but she just wanted to be in where it is warm and where it is safe. But there's always a delay between when we hear her scratching at the door and when we let her in. And we have this little routine. My other half, Jonathan, he says, are all the windows shut down to like 1 inch so she can't get out? We're on the 4th floor. If she gets out, she's clumsy, she'll fall. So we need to make really sure that she's going to be safe. Are all the knives put away? Are there any knives on any surfaces? Are there any stacks of books balanced precariously where if she climbs them, she'll fall off? Are there any fairy lights within easy kitten reach? Because she chomps. There are so many dangers in that flat, and we have this whole routine. We have to make sure the flat is safe, and then we can let her in. She has no idea of any of the dangers that await her, which we are protecting her from. I have no idea of the dangers that I've been protected from over the last 26 years since my last drink on the 24th of July, 1993, but I get to see a parallel life mirrored in people I see in AA who unfortunately slip, and I watch this screenplay develop side by side with me, and in those moments I think, but for the grace of God go I. But there's me like the cat, marching in, wondering why it's taken so long for me to get the treats. No idea, no clue what's really going on. And I obviously do want to talk about steps 4 and 5, but I need a context. I need to create a box to put something in the box. My drinking is very simple. When I was 18, it was my 18th birthday, and of course, I was keen to have the big night. I mean, I'd been drinking for years. I'd constructed hiding places for alcohol from an early age, which were like religious shrines for me. So whatever else was going on, the little hidden space beneath the drawer with the nail in the drawer so that you couldn't pull the drawer, you had to put your hand over the top of the drawer underneath to get the bottle of gin. Whatever was going on, I knew that bottle was there, so I was going to be okay. Because before I discovered gin, I was not okay on any recognizable level. I have a very clear memory of being 11 and being at home with my parents. It was a while after my brother had committed suicide from his alcoholism. I barely knew any of this at a conscious level. I don't know about your families. My family did not tell the truth. We don't have alcoholics, we have lazy people. When my mother describes anyone as lazy, we know they're drinking a little more than is strictly good for them. They didn't tell me he'd committed suicide, but I saw it in dreams. I saw the room, and eventually when I was told what had happened, my description of the room matched the truth. So I knew things I shouldn't have known. And I remember sitting watching television. We watched television a lot, because no one really spoke about anything. And I remember sitting on the sofa and I lay down, I turned my face to the back of the sofa, and I still remember the brown stripes of the sofa, and thinking, I never want to turn back in the other direction towards the world. But then I found gin. 18th birthday. By 7:45, I'd started drinking at 7:15. By 7:45, I was so drunk, I was reeling, I was throwing up in bushes. The rest of the evening was a disaster. A lot of people had a lot of fun drinking. I had a lot of moments when I thought in about 15 minutes' time I'm going to have a lot of fun. There are a couple of bars in central London I used to go back and forth between. And as soon as I got there, I was disappointed, and I would have a drink and then walk to the other bar thinking maybe it's going to be okay. And I would go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And the funny thing was, I wasn't the only person that was doing this. There were 20 or 30 other people going back and forth, and I knew their faces, and there was this little nod of recognition. Oh, but you're coming back this way, but I'm going over there. What? It didn't make sense. Even I realized in my alcoholic haze that I was never going to find what I was looking for, but I had no choice but to keep seeking, because there was no other reality available to me. That was the only reality available. If you drink a bottle of gin a day for a few years, you're going to develop consequences. And I would find myself, in response to these consequences, struck sober. There was never any notion of moderate drinking. So continuing to drink forever, I kind of knew always at some level that this was not going to be viable. My drinking was too aggressive and too violent in terms of my internal state. I mean, it manifested. I was physically violent against objects mostly. I was a damager of things. But I knew internally, this is not sustainable for a lifetime. I'm going to have to do something about this. Moderation was just not constitutionally possible for me. So when it talks about a physical craving, in the doctor's opinion, it doesn't mean that I sensed the desire for a drink in a physical way. It meant that I wanted another drink, and that wanting was constitutional. It came from somewhere beyond my mind, beyond my reason. I cannot drink moderately. So I now have two options: to stop altogether or to drink myself to death. And sometimes with the physical craving, when people are explaining it to sponsees, they talk about the drinking bout during the course of the evening. So you have the first drink, the second drink, the fourth drink, the 32nd drink. But the frightening thing about the physical craving is that it's still there the next day when you wake up. And I relapsed, or rather resumed drinking in 1991 after a 3-month period of sobriety. And I went into a fog, and it was a good 16 months before it occurred to me that I'd ever been sober before. But I couldn't flick the switch and get myself sober. I was struck sober. In Bill's story, it talks about him being separated from alcohol. He did not separate himself. Something separated him. In my case, it was circumstances. I was separated from alcohol. So I've got this faulty off switch, and I'm drinking. I try and press the off switch, but the off switch doesn't work. But there's a faulty on switch as well. It switches itself on. And I don't choose to switch it on. I notice it's been switched on. I can resist for a while, and then I find myself drunk. Those are the two diagnostic features for me of alcoholism. I am bound to drink again unless something fundamental changes. Will come to what that change is. And if I start, I may never stop. That diagnoses me. That's the diagnosis. The prognosis is really simple. This is progressive, it's fatal, it's incurable. The longer I went, the harder it was to come off those slips. I placed myself in dangerous situations. And even though in those periods of sobriety between 1990 in 1993, there were glimmers of hope. There were glimmers of the possibility I might be able to reintegrate back into society. Those were just breaks in the storm. They were not cures. I always ended up back in the drink. And then they tell you a spiritual awakening is necessary to overcome the invisible problem, which is the spring at the core of this spiritual malady. Which I believe, I look at my family, there are some alcoholics and there are some religious fanatics and there are anorexics and there are manic depressives and there are these and there are those. And everyone's got something, and with suicide attempts, everyone seems to get to take a turn. That's just how the family is built. Some of us are alcoholics, some are not. They all have this underlying spiritual malady. For me, alcohol very occasionally treated it, but certainly kept me dangling, thinking it was about to treat it. That spiritual malady needed to be treated in Alcoholics Anonymous, or it was going to treat itself. And I wouldn't get to choose when. I would watch it happening. So that's my step one, is someone was wondering earlier, and we've had some wonderful speakers so far, what do you use instead of the F word? You say banjoed. I was completely banjoed by alcoholism. Step 2 and 3 was very simple for me. It was, this works for you, so it's going to work for me. I don't know what it is, but you're doing better than me, so I'm going to just do as I'm told. There was a conceptual aspect to it too. And back to the kitten. A friend of mine says that the kitten needs to write a book called Working the Steps with Magic Kitten. She got into the most terrible situation a few months ago. There was a plastic carrier bag with those stiff hoop handles, and she got her head stuck through the hoop handle. I mean, it wasn't strangling her, but the bag was attached to her. And she tried going forward, and she tried going backwards, and she tried to use her paw, and nothing worked. And she was getting frantic and more frantic and running around crazily, looking reproachfully at us. And eventually, she was just left there, quivering in the corner. I identify with being left there, quivering in the corner. When I stop running around, eventually I run out of energy, and I'm just quivering in the corner. And Jonathan approached her with a large pair of scissors to cut the bag off her. When you approach me with the Alcoholics Anonymous program, it looks like a large pair of scissors. It does not look like a fragrant geranium balm. It's not inviting. But I trust the person who's holding the scissors. So he approached her and slowly cut round, and there's 2 or 3 stages to get the bag off her. All the while, she was still trembling, and you could tell she was straining every muscle not to react or run away or mess it up in some way. And it took longer than she was comfortable with. But we got the bag off, and then she ran around, and then 5 minutes later she was fine. To me, that is the process I go through with the steps, particularly steps 2 and 3, the trust that the scissors are there to cut away the problem, they're not to kill me. And as I say, I needed to trust the person that was carrying the scissors. The reason I need to turn my will and life over to a power greater than myself is that, left to my own devices, if I continue to make the decisions in my life, I'm going to drink again. I need to not be the ultimate authority. That's the important thing. And so it's wonderful. Great, God's going to look after me with regard to alcohol. Except I get to step 3 in the big book, and there's a devastating line. We had to be convinced that any life run on self-will can hardly be a success. I did not believe this, and in my first few years of recovery, I built up a material life which looked right. I got a career, I got a relationship with someone in AA, we were Mr. and Mr. AA. We had a house, we had a mortgage, we had pensions, we had holidays, we had a social life. I had sponsees. And as my old sponsor Brian said, it was ashes in my mouth. And at 8 years sober, I was waking up with panic attacks at 4 o'clock in the morning, knowing rationally that I shouldn't be having them. I'd had enough therapy to understand the mechanics of the machine, what it was in my childhood, what it was in my parents' conduct, blah, 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 that explained why I was responding the way I was responding, but it didn't stop me responding the way I was responding. I could do a good impression of doing God's will, but I couldn't do God's will because I still had a plan. The purpose of steps 4 and 5 for me is not to make me more effective in the world in order that I get all the things that I need to get. The curse of steps 4 and 5 is that they will do that. If you do 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9, keep your nose clean, probably the external life will improve. For some people it does, for some people, disconcertingly, it doesn't. But for me it did, and that was the curse, because I missed what the point of it was. In step 10, I'm short-sighted and long-sighted at the same time. We have entered the world of the spirit, it says after step 9. It also talks about the great reality. It doesn't say there are multiple realities in a hierarchy. There's just one. And this, whatever this is, ain't it. I was trying to get this world to work. I was trying to get a material life to solve a problem deep inside me. And it was like pouring liquid into an invisible bucket. There's nothing to catch it. This friend of mine says a slotted spoon doesn't hold much soup. So there's a more fundamental thing going on in steps 4 and 5 for me. And the reason I think steps 4 and 5 are so genius, and actually way beyond the capabilities of the wonderful people that wrote it, they were, in my belief, channeling something far greater because of its flexibility to any possible scenario. I've done the steps in other fellowships. I'm not going to name names. But I love the big book approach. I've tried other things. Its simplicity and flexibility can adapt to anything going on inside me in any situation. I sponsor a lot of people. I always have in AA, particularly the last few years. The phone rings a lot. And the content of 4 out of 5 phone calls is, I'm upset. Now, it sounds, if you're not paying attention, it sounds like each situation is different and that you have to get your little pad and pen out and chart out the family relationships with dotted lines here and to understand what's going on so that you can help them. And then they phone up 2 days later and there is another situation and they're upset. And you get the pad and the pen out and let's work it out. Let's do some inventory. Let's look at the mistakes. Let's look at the self-seeking. But something's been missed. If you're upset every day for 20 years, And the situation seems to change, but the feeling is the same, but wearing a different hat. You're missing something. There's a difference between form and content. I've been to AA meetings where every word was impeccable, every aspect of the organization was irreproachable, where you could track every single statement to a quotation from the big book. They did nothing wrong, and I was like the cat in Pepe Le Pew. I just wanted to get out of there. And I went to a meeting with my friend Tom in Oakland, and there was no statement made in that room which you could trace to a line in the big book. But I was at the heart of something. I felt at home. I felt loved by the people around me. And about 5 years later, I realized that it had the content of the big book because it had the spirit of the ideas behind it. But it was done so deftly, no one would have known. The injection, like nurses give kids injections, and the kid doesn't know the injection has been given because they're being distracted by the sweet. And this is about content, not form. So why was I so upset? Why the step 4 is so brilliant is it works with me where I am right now. And when I'm with sponsees, it works with them where they are right now. It doesn't get you to punch above your spiritual weight. It starts with the thing that is so obvious to you, which is that you are bleeding and on fire. And it says, who did it? Make a list. Footnote, my friend Narinda, I asked her to do a step 4. We got to the first column. She had 900 names. She comes from a Sikh family. Her parents were both one of 9 children. She had literally hundreds of cousins with a dozen resentments against each. And she looked very disappointed on one level that I said, no, we're not going to be discussing every single cousin. But she was relieved at the same time. In The Simpsons, when he writes the repeated line on the blackboard in the opening credits, you don't learn more by saying the same thing over and over and over again. In fact, it dulls the senses, and the possibility is that you'll actually miss the truth. So like when a doctor takes blood to ascertain what's wrong with you, he doesn't take all of your blood and leave you this sort of empty shell. We take and I've seen people do step 4s where they're left like an empty shell because everything is sucked out of them. They've got 4 ring binders. It takes 2 years. They're weeping in every meeting. God bless them, but I don't want to do that ever again. The more I write, the bigger I seem to be in the situation. So we keep it simple. We do a sample. Where it gets comprehensive is forgiveness, bottom of 66, top of 67. Where it gets comprehensive is the list of character defects and the harms I've done to other people. If you've harmed 900 people, hard luck, you have to go and make amends to 900 people. With me, it was about 200. But the resentment bit, why am I so upset? And so we've got a list. What do we do next? We say, what did they do? Charge list, you're the prosecutor. What have they done wrong? And I was going through this with a bit of inventory with a friend of mine the other day, and I think it took her 10 minutes to get all the charges out. And sometimes this is part of the process. I lead people through every single step of the step 4. I don't send them out there into the cold, dark night and expect them to come back with Proust. It's just not going to happen. I've got to lead them through because I'm teaching them the method at the same time that they are doing their first step 4. These are 2 separate projects, and the first one has got to be overseen. And so we process everything, make sure it's understood, every single line. And so 10 minutes to get through the second column. And I said to her, it was something to do with her sister. I said to her, would it be fair to say that you could boil that 10 minutes of material down to she is irrational, she is aggressive, she is uncooperative. If she stopped being those three things, if she became rational, if she became cooperative, if she stopped attacking you, would you still have a problem with her? And she thought for a moment and said, no, that would do it. That's enough. So we boiled this huge complex situation down to a very simple second column. And in the big book, it's incredibly simple. I mean, there's a story here which is implied but not stated. Mr. Brown, the cause, his attention to my wife. Don't you bet there's a huge history behind that? And maybe he discussed it with his sponsor, but it has no business in the second column. I've heard many step fives over the years where someone rattles off the first two columns, who they're upset by, and it's not just anger, it talks about being hurt, being threatened, injuries, grudges, any kind of negative reaction to what I perceive to be going on around me. P.S. It's not necessarily what is going on around me, but what I perceive to be going on around me. I've heard people rattle that off and then say, this affects my pride, self-esteem, personal relations, sex relations, ambition, security, pocketbooks. And they just repeat these 7 areas of self. And I did that for years, having no clue why I was doing it, and knowing that the person who was listening to my step 5 also had no clue why we were saying it. And there are a couple of lines in the big book. At the bottom of that section, it says, when we were done, we considered it carefully. And then there's another question a couple of pages later. Where was I self-seeking? And I've discovered whenever I am upset, I'm comparing my perception of reality to a set of demands that I have for it. I'm finding a gap in between, and I press the big red button and go, wah. So if I'm upset, I need to do one of two things. I need to change the entire world. And there are people that try to do that, and for a while they were successful. You know, Stalin had a good few years at the beginning. Just because things are going your way doesn't mean you're doing God's will. That's in my daily corrective measures, to remind myself of that truth. And I think the poet Rumi says it's easier to wear slippers than to carpet the whole world. The problem is not out there. The problem is that I have a set of demands that I am measuring the universe against. And I'll give you an example. My clients in my business, they send me documents and I fiddle with them and then send them back. I'm a typist, basically, a glorified typist. And I send the material back, and sometimes I get an email which says, in the subject line, so you know it's important, client feedback. This is not good news. And you know in cartoons where the character's stomach leaps out and then literally hits the floor, for years that's what it felt like. Now I look at that. What is going on behind that is a little story I'm telling myself. I'm not upset by the situation. It's just pixels on a screen. The pixels on the screen are not harming me. They're not doing anything to me. It's the story I'm telling myself. And the story I tell myself is, they think I'm a terrible translator. They think I can't do this. And looking at those 7 areas, if I consider why those 7 areas are affected and ask myself the question, where am I self-seeking? I'll get to the demands. And what I discover in personal relations and sex relations, that's how I want people to treat me, how I want persons to relate to me. There's no mystery as to what personal relations means. What do I want you to do in my life? And my demand, I discovered, you see, I thought I was this little low self-worth, wilting violet. Actually, the demand is you must praise, love, and respect me at all times. And if you have a criticism, have the grace to keep it to yourself. And this little line in the software is running the whole time. There's a bit of my brain which is scanning every situation, every response to me to see whether you are complying with this demand. Now, that's going to use up disk space. And I would wonder why I'm so tired. That's just one of the demands, let me tell you. What are the ambitions? What is the security in the pocketbooks? It's not very complicated. I want to be protected against any ups and downs of the world. I'm fine as long as my society is stable and the economy is buoyant, and if it's not, boy, do I need a buffer so I can get out. And this is all wired in at some level, so that if something threatens me, just one client, one job, it lights up the whole neural network of these demands behind this whole structure for how the world needs to be for me to be okay. And behind that is the pride and the self-esteem. I have an image of myself that if I can't match that image, I might as well not be here. And you've got to see it too. And there's something another speaker says about when you treat me special, I feel okay. If you just treat me like everyone else, I feel like I'm not there. I needed to drop the demands, but I couldn't drop the demands. This is the problem. So I get to the end of the first three columns, and I discover that I'm in serious trouble. Everything that goes on in the world seems to affect me. I've now understood that the problem is me, the problem is not you. There is a way of being at peace in any situation, if only I drop the demands, but the demands are right in front of my face, and I can't get rid of them. And there's a few little stages that I have to go through. First of all, to realize this system is never going to work. When it talks about the futility of resentment, it's deeper than that. It's the futility of the whole system where I think if I rearrange my material circumstances to the family and the job and the career and the image and everything that goes with it, I'm going to reach peace. And for years, I missed the line on page 61 where it says, was he not a victim of the delusion that he can wrest happiness and satisfaction from this world if only he manages well? I thought that my mental state was a function of what was going on in the material world. And it's a confusion of levels. I don't even believe that my physical brain is where my consciousness resides. Now, this is a personal belief. If you don't like personal beliefs, put some cheese in your ears for the next 2 minutes. But not Swiss cheese, because that's got holes in it. You'll still hear. I believe that consciousness resides wherever it resides, but it is not a function of chemicals in my brain and electrical signals. It's the receiver, not the source. There is a higher reality, there is a greater reality. And I've got 1,000 stories which I think back this up. I have some physicist friends who tell me that one branch of physics is actually suggesting that consciousness resides outside the physical realm. So not all the data are in yet, but it's not Sedona woo-woo. There is possibly some truth to this. But the other reason I believe it, I've got a coffee machine at home. When it's working well, it makes this pleasant hum. If you put the pod in wrong, it makes this awful, cranky, crotchety sound. This sort of scraping, grinding. When I am operated in accordance with manufacturer's instructions, there's a gentle hum. When I'm not, when I'm full of untruth, I make a horrible noise. So the reason I believe some of the ideas I've been given, which I objected to, which I didn't like on any level, which challenged everything I believed, when I applied them, I found they were true. Suddenly the key opened the lock and everything relaxed. That's why I believe it. I needed to access a greater reality. But first, I had to recognize I don't like the world as I see it. It's no good being, as a friend of mine calls it, a bliss ninny, and pretending everything out there in the world sense is fine. I've really got to say, I don't like what I see. But there is another way to look at this. Maybe there is another way to look at this. Living this way is futile. It'll also kill me because I'll drink again. And it's also really embarrassing that the people you respect the least are the ones who are totally in control of your emotional life. Whatever the jerk did, do you really want him to be controlling your behavior because you've pushed down your consciousness of what he did? So that's where I get the willingness from. And then there's a bunch of prayers, top of page 67. This is a sick man. When I am in the material world and I have no awareness of what lies beyond, it's dog eat dog. There is only one software program in the material realm. So they're operating by it as well. They're just trying to survive. They're not doing it to me. There's a wonderful line in my cultural reference range can be very narrow at times, so I'm going to quote from Friends. There's an episode where the Jennifer Aniston character is teaching the Matt LeBlanc character how to sail. She is an expert sailor. He is terrible at it. She's shouting. He's getting upset. He says, "Stop yelling at me." She said, "I'm not yelling at you. I'm yelling near you." The terrible stuff that happened in my childhood, yes, it happened. It happened to my body. It happened to the consciousness that I was then. But there was part of me which is unstained by any of that, and that part of me is part of the great reality. And the great reality, the rest is a dream. And the funny thing is, my sponsor says, if something keeps happening, it's because you like it. Whatever pain appears to be manifesting on the surface, I did not address my sex and romance addiction until I was seriously done with it. Whatever pain it was bringing up, clearly it was a price that I was willing to pay because it was doing something else for me. Ditto sugar, ditto all sorts of other things. And what I was willing to put up with, to suffer the indignity of constant resentment, grinding fear, what I was after was specialness, separation. I'm over here, you're over there. I exist with everything that goes with it. And I don't care, the ego doesn't care if it hurts. It just wants you separate. For years, I would hear that line in the 12 and 12 where it talks about being a worker amongst workers. And I recognized intellectually I should want this, that this should be an attractive proposition. But it felt like a missile was being fired at my head. That would be the end of me. And of course it is, but it's the end of the hero of a dream, and nothing's really happened. I don't need to find my way back to God. I need to take the paper bag off my head. And with that perception, I don't need the material world to be a particular way. What I've been taught is that if I'm upset, I'm wrong. There is always a different way to look at this. I was upset a couple of days ago. I phoned my best friend, and my first line was, "I must be seeing this wrong because I'm upset. Can you give me a right perception?" And I made the policy decision I would accept his view of the situation rather than testing it against me first, testing it against my consciousness first. I was just going to accept it as right, then apply it, and then it would prove itself to be right. The big danger, the iterative loop I would get stuck in is when you presented a solution to me in AA, I would ask the problem, my ego mind, its opinion on the proposed solution. What I get to do is, I was introduced to the idea a while ago that if you can choose the ego, you can also choose God. And that's what I'm doing in step 3. That's what I'm doing in the morning when I say to the higher power, please direct my thinking. That phrase is wonderful, but it implies there are 2 possible directions. You can't go in another direction until you admit the possibility that there is one and that you don't like the direction you're going in at the moment. And as soon as I go back to that decision-making room where at some point, I don't know when, I chose the ego over God, the room appears. I did not know it was there. As soon as I wanted it, as soon as I admitted the possibility, I could go back to the decision. Choose against the ego, choose for God. The room appears. The decision seems possible. And I gave up this little tin pot image of myself for everything. I get to be part of a greater whole, whether it's a group, whether it's a couple, whether it's a family, whether it's my home group, whether it's the worldwide fellowship of AA, whether it's being part of nature. I get to be part of that whole. And the funny thing is, nothing is thereby destroyed except the illusions. Step 4 is not about analyzing the inside of the paper bag that is over my head, blocking the sunshine out. It is about facing the horror of what I've painted on the inside of that, so I'm willing enough to risk taking it off. And the way I do that is really simple. It's in step 5, telling the truth, in somewhere between 40 minutes and an hour. All condensed down. Because with my sponsees, we've gone through everything with a fine-tooth comb already. The summary in step 5, it talks about the exact nature of our wrongs. And it talks about every twist of character. There is a finite number of those. Every dark cranny of the past, there is a finite number of those. If I can get it out in 1 hour, I can walk all the way around it and say, that's the reason the last 10 years has been a disaster. It can seriously be summarized on 2 sheets of paper. Let's rip the paper up, and then my sponsor says to me, let's go for a pizza. And I discover that I am okay. I've simply had the wrong software loaded. Let's press delete, which is 6 and 7. And then in 8 and 9, a bunch of conversations. The great reality was given to me when I completed the last amend, when there was literally no one left on the planet who I hadn't done my utmost to make amends to. I scoured and scoured and scoured. When I finished the last amend, I went for a run, and I said to my higher power, if there is someone I still need to approach, there are people whose names I don't know, who I pray for, and I do alternative things in the universe for. But I went for that run, and no name occurred to me. I've been under a blanket my whole life, and lots of kind people, some paid, some unpaid, helped me analyze the blanket. The process of 1 through 9 took the blanket off. Boy, do I not want to go back under it. Once you see the sunlight, who would put a paper bag back on their head? I would, because my ego is still there, which is why specialness will always have some kind of attraction. Having an identity, having a personality, in the world sense, will always, because you're surrounded by it. There are some other aspects of step 4 I want to cover. The important thing for me in step 4 is to get to the bottom of why I'm so upset. But then there's a bunch of questions on page 67 where it gets really concrete and really practical. And there are people number them differently. I see 8 questions. Some people see fewer or more. What were my mistakes? And I had to have a sponsor rewire my perception of every situation on my step 4. That's the mistake. Yes, there might have been some practical mistakes too. There are some other questions too. But the point of those is to give me a method of processing any situation in my life and to go from the problem to the solution. There's no point in circling. I circled, someone else spoke about it, in the first 9 steps for years, but reconstructed my life on the same basis. And it talks on 69 about how we deal with sexual conduct and our relationships with others. And it gives you a model. It tells you to look at your behavior and where it was wrong, where your thinking and behavior was wrong. It's a different set of questions than on 67, but the internal substance is very, very similar. And then it asks for a sane and sound ideal. What is your sane and sound ideal going to be? And then we've got to be committed to working towards that. And now, it's talking about the sexual inventory, but it says, in other words, we treat sex as we would any other problem. It never told us how to deal with any other problem. It just slides that in there. But that's how I deal with any problem. And what I've been taught to do is, without the reconstruction that it talks about on page 83, I'm going to rebuild myself. If new software isn't loaded, I'm going to rebuild the whole world using the old software. And it does, this is where the work is in the daily work of looking at each situation in my life, saying, what is my sane and sound ideal? And that's very concrete. That's nothing to do with what I'm going to get out, it's what I'm going to put in. What should my belief be? What should my thinking be? What should my behavior be? And this gives me a model for the Step 11 review at night on page 86. Where was I resentful? Where was I selfish? What have I done wrong today? And I look at that sane and sound ideal, and I have one for each area of my life, each domain of my life. And I say, well, what happened? Does the sane and sound ideal need to be updated to reflect different circumstances, or did I just mess up again? And that's really important. If I just messed up, I surrender it to the higher power, and we have another go tomorrow. But sometimes stuff is genuinely baffling, and I need to look in the traditions, I need to look in the concepts, I need to talk to people in my home group. But the other couple of things that I ought to share, those questions on page 67 about mistakes and fear and self-seeking and selfishness and dishonesty and wrongs and where was I to blame, where was I at fault. It's been very interesting taking other people through that as well as going through it myself. It doesn't say anywhere that the list delimits those questions. So it doesn't say you only ask those questions for the people on the list. There was someone I was talking to a few years ago, and she did an amazing step forward. She had 20 or 30 resentments. We went through all of it. And I said, those 8 questions, are there any other areas of your life you need to ask those questions about? She said, I don't think so. I said, well, just give it a go. How about your physical health? How about your relationship with money? How about your relationship with politics? How about all of those other areas where you don't necessarily have resentment? Those questions on 67, a friend of mine says there isn't even a 4th column, it's just a bunch of questions. And to look at my whole life and answer those questions. And I've discovered, boy, there's a lot wrong with me on top of alcoholism. But the solution for alcoholism has been the solution for all of those things as well. But what this boils down to is that moment in step 5 when I'm looking someone in the eye and I can see that they love me. One of my amends I had a relationship in my teens with someone who was very abusive, who was in a power position. And this person made my life hell, and then I made his life hell. The worm turned, and I started to retaliate and turn other people against him, and I was very vindictive. Regardless of what he had done, I needed to make amends for my behavior towards him, thereby freeing myself. And he said something. In every single amend, people have said something I didn't expect them to say. In 9 out of 10 cases, the unexpected happens. And he said, we loved and hated each other in equal measure. I had no idea there was anything but hate there. Now, it was a horrific scenario, but nonetheless, there is something in me which cannot be destroyed, and which other people love despite themselves, despite the things I do to them. I can't help loving people. When I look at the people that I've loved in AA who've gone into relapse and are destroying themselves, and I do not stop loving them. Now, it's hell while it's happening. But that is what I get in touch with in step 5 and in step 9 and in step 12. That we're all actually okay. And that's a very simple message that AA has to offer, and why it has to remain non-professional for me is, if I'm paying you to tell me I'm okay, how do I know it's true? If you have any investment, if I'm even buying you as my sponsor a coffee, this is at some level, I've turned it from love, which is giving of yourself for fun and for free, expecting nothing in return, into a transaction. And when am I going to get paid? But the one last thing, I got very upset about some political stuff a couple of years ago. And I can get very upset about environmental stuff. I was at a conference, an AA conference in Sedona a few years ago. And my grand sponsor was there, who's got 40 years, and his wife, who's got 42, 43 years. And they were spooked by what was going on politically in the world. And my heart sank when I saw their response. And one day I had breakfast with my friend Kurt from California. And I said, should we have breakfast? And he said yes, and we sat down and I asked him a question, and he spoke for an hour. Which is great, because it just took the pressure off me. And the question was in part about what was going on in the world around us. And I said, are you affected by this? And I looked in his eyes. He didn't need to give a verbal response. Okay, we got an hour of a verbal response. But the response in his eyes showed me that he was fine. And if he was fine, I was fine. And I get to still live in the dream world or the material world. That's where my feet have to be. I work very hard in my career, with my family, in AA, and in other areas too. But those are not the content. Those are the vessel through which love flows. That's the real content, and that comes from above. That's heaven being brought down to earth. So I don't get to pretend the material world isn't there, but I don't have to have my spirit living there because it can't. I was trying to squeeze. There's a line, I'm going to literally finish on this. There's a line from Peanuts where there's Lucy and one of the other characters, and he says, how many times does 4 go into... She says to him, how many times does 4 go into 3? He says, 4 doesn't go into 3. She says, it does if you push. I was trying to push the material world. I was trying to squeeze my spirit into it, and it won't fit. My spirit's been liberated so I can freely move through the world. Thank you for listening.